We don't know how lucky we are to have the BBC. I say that a lot, and will until I die, or it dies, whichever comes first. But what I mean by it in this particular instance is that because they've been around since the dawn of broadcasting in this country, we're one of the few countries in the world where public broadcasting is the rule, not the exception. And TV without adverts is the default setting in our collective national consciousness. Our half-hour sitcoms actually last half an hour, and our hour-long dramas actually last an hour. At least the BBC ones do. But there are still bits between the programmes, of course. There was a time when a lot, some might say a disproportionate amount, of care and attention was lavished upon them. From about 1988 to around 1993, we lived through scholars, if there were any of such a trivial subject, would surely call the golden age of TV presentation. And the fact that this golden age coincides with my childhood is of course entirely circumstantial and irrelevant. The stuff I'm talking about was pioneered, as with so much else in post-1980 British television, by Channel 4. They were far from the first to have season-specific looks for their trailers, but having more to prove right from the outset, they were the first to make it an art form, creating a whole new package of stings and menus every few months, often quite elaborate and high-tech by the standards of the day. By 1987 or so, they'd moved on to abstract live-action tableau informed by performance art and contemporary dance, because they were Channel 4, and that, at the time, was what they were for. Either way, it set a standard. The BBC were in danger of being shown up. So by the end of 1986, the system was in place on all 4 channels, regional variations on ITV notwithstanding. Between programme promotions were given their own desktop themes every season, including custom-made programme menus and specially filmed stings leading in and out of the trailer. The system lasted throughout the COW and TWO eras of the BBC channels into the first couple of years of the first corporate look. And as time went on, they became increasingly elaborate and involved until they finally snapped like an elastic band and reverted to the start. Now these brief tone poems are practically forgotten, understandably since they were so trivial. But despite that triviality, they were clearly made with love, sweat and creativity. It gave BBC One in particular a sense of personality to rival even the Fluted One and the Balloon. Here is a far from definitive history of the golden age of the seasonal trailer. We'll start in 1986, when trailer stings were commonplace, but the seasonal structure hadn't quite emerged yet.
Look ahead to tomorrow evening.
Fun for Friday night on BBC One at 7 o'clock. Wogan, including Kenneth Williams. Then
Stings were largely interchangeable animations, but this is around the time they started to settle into a pattern dictated by the seasons.
At 8:10, a variety of entertainment for Friday on BBC One.
One of the first really striking packages came that summer with this Cogs and Rivets stop-motion animation for BBC
Turn
One.
on to a new season of entertainment on BBC One.
The following autumn, they went with a CGI'd sundial, which proved sufficiently classy to keep coming out of mothballs at short notice for the next few years. This was a year after BBC One introduced the Cow Globe, of course. For the uninitiated, Cow is short for Computer-Originated World. Soon BBC Two had a new look as well, one which cemented then-controller Graham MacDonald's vision for the channel as a hardcore arts and issues station for cognoscenti. Unfortunately, the inverted stencil logo was singularly inflexible for other promotional use. BBC Two menus in the early days of the TWO tended to be either improvised and utilitarian, or feature entirely unique ways of depicting the station name.
BBC Two presents a new season of drama with The Life and Loves of a She-Devil.
However, with BBC Two being considered a lesser sibling with a vague quality over ratings philosophy, trailer stings weren't really seen that much on the station anyway.
The Life and Loves of a She-Devil, part of an exciting new season of drama on BBC Two.
The seasonal system started to slowly solidify, use that as a tongue twister if you like, in 1987, with the spring and summer sporting this Clarice Cliffian rendering of BBC One.
On BBC One starts in a moment when Oliver Twist makes new friends.
This is inviting. My new friend, Oliver Twist.
But it was still far from a rigidly enforced totalitarian dogma. The sundial still showed up on a few occasions just because it's neat. Autumn saw the first use of animated live action.
A look at programmes later on this evening on One. In a moment, Mark Lester and Rolf Harris join Wogan. Then at 7:40, Brockside goes in search,
as well as the first appearance of the globe in a sting. The globe would soon become not just the symbol, but the effective face, if not the anima, of the station under Jonathan Powell. Computer animation was the in thing in the late 80s, and was now easy and cheap enough to produce that it was worth doing so for such relatively trivial matters as trailer stings. New Year 1988 was heralded by this swooshy, mercurial, planetary, atomic whatever machine, used on both stations. Winter and Spring 1988 on BBC One was graced by what I must assume is a fairly unscientific rendering of how your television works, or did at the time. Yes, it's the cathode ray tube show. BBC Two using something faintly similar, but much more fashionable and strange.
Film seasons new on 2.
In the summer, BBC One brought forth the fondly remembered Globe as Marble look.
Entertainment for Saturday night at 6 o'clock. We're in the land of the pharaohs.
Which, with its ritualistic pinball table feel, looked like the sort of thing you might see of an evening at Tommy's holiday camp.
And with the UK Snooker Championship rounding off the evening at 11:55, that's Saturday night here on BBC One.
By now, the unprecedented level of creative freedom that the presentation department were enjoying was starting to go to its head. In a good way. Better yet, they were also starting to get a fairly tasty budget to match. With no one telling them not to, not even Michael Checkland, they started to actively stretch their creative muscles, and even to see the stings, grabbers and menu designs as works capable of having actual worth in their own right, even artistic merit. That's the impression I get from the run of trailer packages from 1989 through to about 1991 anyway.
Start Friday evening the Wogan way.
BBC One's winter in 1989 was appropriately dark, cold and windy, with a touch of mystery in the closing shot of a trench-coated man hurriedly vacating a shaft of light. What did it all mean? Nothing in particular, just winter on One. An arrangement of elements intended to provide a vague sense of winteriness and BBC One-ishness, the latter mostly exemplified by the sundial recording clock face. After the expressionism of the logo-centred 2D animations, BBC presentation was now embracing impressionism. I know it's pretentious to talk like this about things as trivial as trailer stings from 1989, but I don't care, mainly because it is also true. It might be the smallest of creative fry, ultimately trivial in function and all but designed to have only momentary impact, but the presentation department at the time didn't act that way. Significant time and effort was expended, and that deserves to be recognised, as do the very real audiovisual and yes, even artistic techniques they employed, especially on BBC Two, where, as you'll see, some amount of art student waffle really can't be avoided. BBC Two were now in direct competition with Channel 4 for the esoteric, iconoclastic and explicitly, unashamedly artistic image. Channel 4 may have had a slight advantage in their capacity to outsource to the likes of Oscar Griot, who named his animation house after a Charlie Parker instrumental, and it doesn't get much more 80s Channel 4 than that. But the BBC presentation department were no slouches in themselves. BBC Two's winter took up the baton from the Paris Fashion Week Christmas ident with a stylish David Bailey meets film noir look, in high contrast black and white apart from the three colours that are in the logo, which also happen to be the canonical television picture colours of red, blue and green, of course. In fact, in lieu of a more malleable logo, the presentation department would often fall back on those three colours in that order, as shorthand for BBC Two during this era.
Peter O'Toole stars in The Dark Angel on Wednesday at 9:25 on 2.
Over on the mainstream BBC One, they'd apparently caught wind of the prevailing late 80s advertising atmosphere. Sophisticated aspiration. Spring and summer were full of brightly coloured flowers, tanned bodies in one-piece swimsuits, Grecian urns, and indoor swimming pools with the globe patterned within. BBC One was for people of wealth and taste. Except Satan. Whereas BBC Two was for whoever the Late Show was for.
The Face of Spring. Sunday evening is devoted to Hotel Terminus, an exhaustive...
The Face of Spring was very Channel 4-ish, and it was arch and artistic, almost to the point of being actively off-putting. Which surely came close to missing the point completely.
Marcel Opel's epic investigation is on Sunday at 8:15.
In the summer, this evolved into an even creepier CGI mascot of a sort of shark-toothed tape deck robot. BBC Two was no longer compromising. This was Art Christ now. Fortunately, the main channel was much more personable, as the theme of soft focus aspiration all the way was continued and built upon in the autumn under the slogan, The Star Attraction. The look was both suitably autumnal, with billowing drapes, darkening skies and multicoloured fireflies, and suitably aspirational, with its setting of a spacious modern living room, all form over function decor, glass coffee tables, modern art on the walls and plump vases containing but a single daffodil for that minimalist chic. The kind of room a person of consequence circa 1989 would watch TV in. The image is completed with the near-obligatory tasty sax lick on the soundtrack. Oddly, no figure 1 in the money shot, just BBC. I think the TV set is supposed to stand in for a number, the way I believe the trenchcoat guy in the winter look was. It didn't work then either. Note the subtle appearances of the globe on the vase and in a painting, and the practically subliminal insertion of images from previous trailer packages on the TV screen. BBC Two's machine for autumn 1989 was even more inscrutable than the film noir look, a collection of wheels, turntables, gas pipes and metallic plates, which definitely fulfilled the spoken mandate to be different. At least they deigned to include the logo this time. The 90s dawned with plans afoot to finally bring the on-screen identities of the BBC's channels in line with the major image relaunch of the entire corporation some years earlier. 1990 was therefore a lap of honour for both the cow and the stencilled TWO. And if anything, the care and effort put into their promotional packages increased still further.
Tuesday on 1, and Bill Treacher of EastEnders takes a holiday 90. Then a 5th anniversary...
Winter on 1 was graced with a combination of intricate model work and line animation which must have taken absolutely ages to put together. A different kind of sophistication to the previous look, this married jazz-age aesthetics to a yuppie chic sensibility. Except that if you put it that way it sounds utterly hideous, which it wasn't. It was warm and welcoming, as BBC One style so often was.
And here's the look of Monday night on 1.
BBC Two would go with explicit surrealism throughout 1990, starting with a game attempt at actually dealing with the uncommercial, inflexible logo they were stuck with. They had ducks carrying the letters around in front of some grey drapes, bits of old metal forming the T,
a new series of documentaries on 2.
Segments of the O made of newspaper fading in and out of existence, and a sardine tin which turned out to contain an entire ocean in which the T was drowning.
Just part of what makes Tuesday on 2 unique.
The sheer thickness and solidity of the letters was almost all the TWO logo had going for it, so it was a good idea for them to fetishise them like this. The logo was by now actually quite iconic, but unfortunately it was an icon of dull, ultimately unknowable intellectualism. And there was nothing to be done about that but wait for its replacement. Spring and summer 1990 on 1 probably represents the acme of this entire era of presentation, if only because it actually won design awards. To a gorgeous jazz waltz for violin, piano and guitar, a Holiday 90s style montage unfolds with the BBC One globe represented in various obvious and not so obvious ways.
BBC One.
Over on 2, they'd clearly fallen down some kind of hole in their psyche, and were now creating inscrutable pieces of animation and or contemporary dance which were hard enough to describe, let alone conceive of in the first place. This included a suitably surreal substitute for the TWO logo. Nice try. Autumn, as usual, meant darkness and drawing inward. This time it was BBC One who moved in the direction of contemporary dance, with a touch of gymnastics. This one also featured another take on the previous year's watery globe theme, refined via practical effects into a downright haunting tableau. BBC Two's autumn look moved away from acid house meets Dali meets the Bible, and onto Peter Greenaway influenced formalism, right down to the twins from the Draftsman contract. Oh yeah, and some versions had someone singing the channel name, for spookiness. In 1991, of course, it was all change. But not immediately. For one reason or another, the new look didn't debut until mid-February, meaning that the new season trailers had to be tailored to fit both styles.
Monday night on 1, and Wogan's guests include rock star Sting and actor Ian McShane.
BBC One's winter togs that year were probably the last great seasonal trailer package. Well, at least they were to my mind. And I'm pretty sure that my mind is the only one that's expended anywhere near this much energy on the subject, so it's pretty much official and empirical fact. Deal with it. Anyway, the theme of the package was emerging light, being let in through curtains, windows and doors, banishing shadows and bringing things to life, all in a setting resembling an abstract representation of the aspirational house of a year earlier. Although to notice this theme, you had to pay the kind of close attention only a madman like myself would bother with, which in those days would have required a VCR and a lot of time on your hands. In practice, what imprinted itself on your psyche was usually just a sense of random weirdness, especially the bit with the teapot and the hat. Talking of random weirdness, this time BBC Two went with a crystalline/oceanic motif, with oysters, fish and ruddy grey eyeballs looming out of a rocky animated landscape. This being the last package to feature it, they finally surrendered and put the TWO logo in the top left-hand corner. They also put the day of transmission there, in what feels like an acknowledgement that this was their last chance to do something vaguely different, and what the hell, might as well, am I right? And then, 6 weeks into 1991, Lambie Nairn attack. Interesting seeming note. If you're watching in the Anglia area at this point, Lambie Nairn and or his company were responsible for all of your terrestrial channel's idents.
Sunday on BBC One.
The trailer packages, of course, were designed to survive and simply adapted to the new system. No longer could they write BBC One in wacky letters, or design what amounted to a custom logo, or leave BBC Two to be implied by the context. Now they were mandated to end with the logo in the top left corner. The fonts were normalised as well. No agonising over the ligatures and kerning for your Perpetua variant. All promos used Futura Bold and Futura Bold alone. But that was okay, especially for this one, which was custom built from the start with the new BBC One logo in mind. But with the introduction of the corporate look, the writing was on the wall for the season trailer package. Channel 4 had already abandoned the practice in favour of blip-vert grabbers, and now the BBC were imposing creative restrictions. Only small ones at first, but they did add up.
Tuesday night on One.
BBC One's look for the spring and summer of 1991 was based around synchronised swimming and pixelation. No, not pixelation. Pixelation. That's a technical term for when you animate the human body like claymation, by photographing tiny movements. Or if you're lazy, editing out frames, but it doesn't work very well that way. Jan Spankmajer's fond of it. However they did it, it must have taken a bloody long time to achieve these elaborate doily-shaped tableaux. In marked contrast, BBC Two's package for the summer was minimalist, with a capital M. Elliptical, almost alien humour was the order of the day, with inscrutable black and white scenes containing but a single prop in the foreground. Until the BBC Two logo pops up, which is the cue for the prop to come to colourful life. If anyone was under the impression that the revamp had changed BBC Two's basic Art Christ sensibility, this would have proved them wrong. That autumn on One seemed to have an inscrutable theme again, this time colour. Instead of a single scenario type thing, we're treated to a disconnected montage of seemingly random scenes. A rabbit emerging from a hat, a cat breaking a vase of Walter White's meth, and some orange balloons in front of a big wheel at night, all featuring bright, vivid colours standing out against their backdrops. And over on BBC Two,
Friday on 2. Public Eye investigates the...
How do I even describe this thing? I genuinely don't know what this is. Never mind how the designers came up with it. This might very well have been the product of just dicking around with a few disparate elements to see what you end up with, which is a far from ignoble design method if you ask me. By now, though, these things were starting to be seen less often, especially on BBC Two, as the new channel logo started to take prominence over whatever vague notions the presentation department had come up with that day. That began to be reflected in the seasonal trailers by 1992.
New comedy, new for 92 on BBC One.
Winter on One was positively retro, with a 2D computer animation of several fluted ones tumbling into some kind of abstract representation of BBC One itself, complete with cameos for Britain and the continent. On BBC Two, we had hand-jiving and projection tricks, accompanied by a none more BBC Two jazz arpeggio. This would turn out to be almost the last hurrah of the Yentobi and TWO era late show sophistication, before the channel relaxed under Yentop's protege Michael Jackson into its classic mid-90s era. Still artsy, but not aloof. Spring and summer saw BBC One make a slight return to aspiration, with deliberately detached images of people painting the fluted one on their luxury yacht, or casting shadows on diving boards that coincidentally turned those into the logo, or sunbathing on the beach in such a way as to turn into the logo. Either way, it's all about the logo. Meanwhile, BBC Two had a new face of spring. This was pretty much the last time they'd explicitly insist on being an arts channel, what with the faint resonances of both Picasso and Magritte. Odd and elliptical as usual, but taking great care to include the bladed 2 somewhere. Inspiration was clearly starting to peter out, so there was becoming increasingly little place for this sort of thing. More time spent looking at a cactus or a kite meant less time looking at the actual programme or programmes being promoted. Replacing the props with actual logos was only a partial solution. It was never going to be enough. That autumn's look on BBC One seemed to be 3 things: an attempt at giving the fluted one a personality, an attempt at justifying the seasonal trailer system, and an attempt at compromise by making the stings explicitly about the programming, if only by genre. Or maybe 4 things, with the 4th being noticeably cheap, or at least cheap looking.
Saturday evening highlights on 1.
On BBC Two, they all but surrendered to the overwhelming personality of the Bladed Two, with a trailer package consisting of various semi-random fugues on the logo itself. This turned out to closely anticipate the future, as after that Christmas, the second channel abandoned the seasonal trailer practice altogether in favour of occasional grabbers before or between trailers, although we didn't necessarily notice until the seasons changed and the grabbers didn't. BBC One kept the system going for a couple more seasons. Winter 1993's look was a sort of classier version of the previous season's genre-based animation. Instead of a dancing 2D animated fluted one, a slightly futuristic arrangement of floating screens pay homage to the logo which apparently gave birth to them through the hole. After this, and the previous one's laughing mouth, they wouldn't draw quite so much attention to the fluting in the fluted one, possibly because it creeped everyone out. The final seasonal trailer package was BBC One's in spring and summer 1993. It was a pretty worthy valediction.
Saturday night on BBC One.
A mise en abîme of people in sheds watching the popular BBC One People in Sheds show. Confusing, but reasonably memorable. And that was that. BBC One made the inevitable switch to grabbers in autumn of 1993. Theirs was similar to those on 2 in that they centred around the logo, but with BBC One being much more serious and authoritative than 2, they concentrated on the logo's construction instead of its personality, usually depicting it as a looming monolith of some sort. The channel needed to relaunch itself somehow at this point anyway, as the inspiration had been draining away from the programming itself, even faster than it had from the trailers. Alan Yentop was in charge now, and the autumn 1993 season was the first entirely under his supervision. It's probably at least partially a coincidence that it was also the first to dispense with the old seasonal wallpaper style of presentation, if only because BBC Two had done it already. But only partially. A big part of BBC One's revival under Yentop was the savings of £25 million from an efficiency review that must surely have included the scrapping of limited-run seasonal trailers, in favour of long-term grabbers in perpetuity. Whatever the case, an era was over, although such a tiny and trivial one that few people noticed. I was one of those few. A solemn and thoughtful 10-year-old who always enjoyed the turning of the BBC seasons because of the interesting and, yes, artistic ways that the BBC would promote their programming. Their creativity stimulated my own. They were probably, no joke, my first exposure to non-representational forms of art. Just casually sitting there on the TV between Wogan and Allo Allo. Little works of impressionism, gleefully placing form over function because why on earth shouldn't they? There may have been no need to go to this much trouble, no real need to care about the aesthetics at all. I mean, a shiny BBC One logo would have done the job and done it just as well on a technical level, but it wouldn't have been as cool. It's a pretty pure example of art for art's sake. And again, I acknowledge that it's basically pretentious to talk like this about promos for Campion and Wicker's World. But then it was basically pretentious of the presentation department at the time to go to this much effort for that sort of thing in the first place. If the alternative is to be dull and utilitarian, give me pretension any day. This was decidedly not Tesco value television. Every season had its own personality, whether warm and welcoming on one, or spiky and confrontational on 2. Now that competition in television is so fierce, there's simply no time, let alone money and effort, to waste on elaborate stings and gnomic animations between programmes when you could just be yelling the title, the time and the channel logo at the top of your voice, and then another and then another. At least that's how the theory goes. But you never know, maybe Slowing down and talking to the viewer may help the information go in better. And at least one person in the world was creatively inspired by the BBC's sheer love of aesthetics for their own sake. Maybe more. Creating more artists can't be a bad thing. The BBC is even more cash conscious now than it was in 1993, with a vaster reach, orders of magnitude more channels, and extra burdens placed on it by hostile politicians. Besides, no one today would allow these through. The whole system is overcomplicated and makes no marketing sense. But there we're talking about the same people who think these somehow did. Clearly, making sense isn't everything.
Drama on One.